Saturday, late August. The Dundas farmers market was already loud with the sound of it. Coolers dragging across asphalt, vendors calling prices, the particular smell of late summer peaches mixing with someone's breakfast crepe drifting from 3 stalls over. Funke Oyalaran was labeling jam jars when the black Audi Q8 rolled slowly past the vendor row and stopped. She heard it before she saw it. The engine note was too smooth for this parking lot, and the tires stopped precisely at the kind of angle that said the driver wanted to be seen from the market entrance. She did not look up right away. Beside her, her 20-year-old daughter Tolu was arranging plum preserves in the front row of the display. Her movements unhurried, her eyes doing the same quiet thing they had been doing all morning, cataloging every face that slowed near the stall without appearing to. The passenger door opened first. A woman stepped out in a linen co-ord, set the color of sea glass, phone already raised at arm's length, capturing the scene the way tourists captured everything. Wide and indiscriminate. Her name was Sabrina, and she had been vlogging their weekend since Thursday. Bradley Norwood came around the front of the car, 48 years old. Good hair, maintained carefully at a place on King Street West he had been going to for 15 years. He had the kind of tan that came from a golf resort, not a backyard, and he was wearing a blazer on a Saturday morning the way men do when they want to make sure no one forgets they own blazers. He saw Funke before she looked up. She heard the exact moment recognition hit him because the quality of his pause changed. It became deliberate, performed. He took a slow breath that was really just a preparation, squared his shoulders without knowing he was doing it, and turned slightly so that Sabrina's camera angle would catch his profile. "Funky," he said, loud enough that the couple at the adjacent honey stall both glanced over. She set down the jar in her hand, wiped her fingers on the small cloth she kept folded at the corner of the table. Then she looked up at him, the way she looked at problems she had already solved. There was no surprise in her face, no warmth either, but also no anger. And it was the absence of anger that made something flicker briefly behind Bradley's eyes, because he had come prepared for anger. Anger was easier. Anger gave him something to stand on. "I didn't know you were doing this," he said, and his tone was the specific kind that wasn't really a statement at all. It was a performance directed at Sabrina's camera, at the couple lingering at the honey stall, at anyone within earshot. His voice carried the way it always had, calibrated for rooms slightly larger than the one he was actually in. Tolu's hands stopped moving among the jam jars. She said nothing, but Funke knew, without looking, that her daughter had already noted the angle of Sabrina's phone, had already assessed which frame of the stall would appear on whatever platform that video was heading toward, and had already decided what she would do about it later. "I do a lot of things," Funke said. Bradley smiled, the version of his smile that was really just his teeth, and glanced back at Sabrina with an expression that said, "See, I told you," as though the entire scene were confirming something he had been saying for months. "You were always so," he trailed off, appearing to search for the word, though he had already chosen it. "Resilient," he said, and the pause before it had been long enough that the word landed like its opposite. Sabrina lowered her phone by a few degrees, just enough that he wouldn't notice, and filmed the side of his face instead. A customer approached the stall, wanting to ask about the crabapple jelly. Funke turned to help her, fully, unhurriedly, as though Bradley had already gone. He hadn't. He stood there for a moment longer than a man who didn't care would stand, before finally moving back to the car. The Q8 pulled away with the kind of smoothness that costs money, and the couple at the honey stall turned back to their tasting, and the market resumed its noise. Tolu waited until the car reached the end of the row and turned out of sight before she spoke. He had her filming, she said. Not a question. "I know," Funke said. "I got the plate." Funke said nothing, but something in her expression shifted in a way that only Tolu, in 20 years of watching her mother's face, could have read correctly. The real story of Bridgelight Technologies was not the one that appeared in the business press, and it was not the one Bradley Norwood told at dinner parties. The version Bradley told was clean and flattering. Two people, a shared vision, the right calls made at the right moments by a man who understood the market. He mentioned Funke in those versions, the way people mention a supporting actor. Not unkindly, but briefly, with an air of generosity towards someone who had played a smaller part than the billing might suggest. The actual version was different in every material detail. Funke had been 26 when she wrote the first version of the architecture that would eventually become Bridgelight's core product. A logistics intelligence system that could predict supply chain disruptions before the signals were visible to anyone not paying very close attention. She had written it on a second-hand laptop in the spare bedroom of a cousin's house in Brampton, working nights after her shift at a call center, surviving on a diet of instant noodles and the specific kind of focus that comes from having no margin for failure. Bradley had come into the picture later. Through a networking event she'd been persuaded to attend, and he had been genuinely useful in the beginning. He was charming in a way that opened rooms Funke hadn't yet learned to navigate, and he was good at making investors feel like they were the ones who had discovered something rather than being sold to. She needed that. In those first years, she needed it badly enough that she let him stand at the front of every presentation while she built the actual thing behind him. The mistake, she came to understand later, was in thinking that need was mutual, that a man who depended on what she built would remain conscious of that dependence. Success had an effect on Bradley Norwood, the way sunlight has an effect on certain plants. It made him grow, but only outward and upward, never deeper. The more Bridgelight grew, the more fully he inhabited a version of himself in which he had always been the visionary, always been the engine, always been the indispensable one. By their 7th year together, he had stopped crediting her in interviews, not because he was calculated about it, but because he had genuinely begun to believe a different story about how things had happened. He started introducing her at industry events as my wife, who helps with the company. He told her, more than once, that her presence in certain rooms made investors uncomfortable, that she came across as too technical, too direct, not quite the face the company needed. She filed each of these away the way she filed everything, quietly, precisely, without letting him see that she was building a picture. When he finally brought divorce papers to the kitchen table 3 years ago, papers already prepared, already reviewed by a lawyer, who had clearly never spoken to Funke. He had done it with the confidence of a man who believed he was walking away with everything that mattered. Bridgelight Technologies, the clients, the reputation, the story. What Bradley did not know was that the patents underlying every product Bridgelight had ever sold were not owned by the company. They were owned by Billionaire Group, a private holding entity that Funke had incorporated quietly and carefully in the early years of the partnership, advised by a corporate lawyer she had found and paid for entirely on her own. She had structured it with the same precision she applied to everything else, not out of suspicion, she told herself at the time, but out of the hard-learned wisdom that no engineer builds a bridge with a single point of failure. When Bradley walked away from that kitchen table 3 years ago, he had walked directly into an arrangement in which everything he thought he owned depended entirely on licenses that Funke controlled. He had simply never bothered to read the original incorporation documents carefully enough to understand what he was holding. She had never corrected his misunderstanding. The market stall had been Tolu's idea, in the end, though Funke had arrived at the same conclusion independently, and said so. For 3 months, the numbers inside Billionaire Group had been wrong in a way that was not random. Small amounts at first. Rounding errors that weren't rounding errors, transfers that arrived 3 days late from subsidiaries that had never once been late in 6 years. Then larger amounts. An investment fund routed through a secondary holding structure that returned 80 cents on the dollar, without any explanation that reconciled cleanly with the audit trail. Funke ran her business on the discipline of pattern recognition. She had built her company on the premise that if you trained yourself to see signals before they became events, You would never be surprised by a crisis, only by the timing of one. And the pattern in front of her now was precise in a way that randomness could not produce. Someone inside Oyalaran Group understood the structure of her auditing systems, understood the specific windows between cross-checks, the exact thresholds below which a transaction would not trigger a secondary review, and was moving money beneath all of it with a patience that suggested they had been studying the system for a long time before ever touching it. The trail, when Tolu first began pulling at it, kept circling back to a cluster of real estate acquisitions along the Dundas Valley corridor west of Hamilton. Agricultural land, mostly, changing hands through shell companies at prices just below what would attract regulatory attention. On the surface, it looked like opportunistic land speculation, but 3 of the parcels bordered a water management zone that the provincial government had quietly flagged for potential infrastructure development. Buried in a planning registry that almost no one researched unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. If those acquisitions were connected to what Funke thought they were connected to, the land would be worth 10 times its current purchase price within 4 years. She needed proximity without exposure. She needed to be in that community. Among the farmers, the local business owners, the weekend regulars. Close enough to hear what was being said in the spaces between transactions without anyone understanding who she was or why she was listening. The Dundas Farmers Market was 3 kilometers from the largest of the acquisitions. She had rented the stall under a numbered company Tolu had set up for exactly this purpose. She made the preserves herself on Sundays, in a kitchen that smelled briefly and pleasantly of cinnamon and stone fruit, and she stood behind the table every Saturday morning in a hoodie and sensible shoes, and she listened. Tolu had a gift for this kind of work that went beyond the analytical. She kept a mental log of every unfamiliar vehicle that slowed near the stall, could carry on a conversation about jam while simultaneously retaining license plate numbers and fragments of overheard conversation, filing them in a memory that worked like a well-indexed database. It was Tolu who noticed, on the 3rd Saturday, that the same gray pickup truck had passed the market entrance without stopping on each of the previous 2 weekends. And it was Tolu who, while making change for a customer purchasing rhubarb compote, noted the driver's face and matched it, 3 days later, to a name in a set of corporate filing documents she had pulled from the Ontario Registry. The name on the filing was a registered agent. The agent represented a company. The company was one of several shell entities purchasing land along the valley corridor, and the agent's name was one that Tolu recognized, because she had seen it in an old contract from the early days of Oyalaran Group. Back when the holding structure was first being built, when Funke had relied on a small circle of trusted people to help her architect something that would last. Bradley returned to the market the following Saturday without Sabrina. He came in the kind of mood that men mistake for generosity when it is actually the afterglow of feeling superior, and he approached the stall with his hands in his pockets and a carefully casual expression that had clearly been rehearsed somewhere between his car and the entrance. He told Funke he had been thinking about her situation, that he wanted to do something decent if she'd let him. He had a number in mind. He named it. For the stall, the inventory, the whole operation. The number he named was less than what Funke had spent on the preserving jars alone. He said it without embarrassment, with the particular confidence of a man who believes the smallness of an offer is itself proof of its generosity, because at least he was offering. Funke let the silence grow for long enough that he felt it before she answered. She told him she would think about it. Nothing in her voice, nothing in her face. A wall so smooth he could not find a seam in it no matter how carefully he looked. He left believing he had planted something. Another detail to add to the story, he kept telling people about where she had ended up. He did not know that 40 minutes after his car left the parking lot, Funke made a phone call. She spoke for less than 90 seconds. She used 7 words that mattered and declined to explain any of them. The head of Oil Aaron Group's financial operations asked one clarifying question, received a one-word answer, and then did exactly what she had been hired to do. By the time Bradley sat down to dinner that evening, every dollar of Oil Aaron Group capital currently supporting the 3 active Norwood Developments projects, a figure he had no idea existed because he had no idea where his financing had actually come from, had been frozen. The name that appeared at the bottom of the shell company's founding document was Gideon Pratt. Tolu had stared at the screen for 4 minutes before she moved. Not because she didn't believe it. She believed it the moment she saw it, in the way certain revelations arrive not as surprises, but as confirmations of something the body already knew. But because she needed to sit with the weight of it before she carried it to her mother. Gideon Pratt had been with Funke since the 3rd year of Oil Aaron Group. He was 51 now, a CFO, with a reputation for being methodical and principled, the kind of man who sent handwritten thank you notes and remembered the names of people's children. He had been with Funke through the worst stretch of the divorce proceedings, when a series of legal challenges threatened to complicate the IP structure she had built, and he had helped her navigate every one of them without flinching. She trusted him the way you trust a load-bearing wall, not by thinking about it, but by leaning on it without fear. Tolu pulled 3 more documents that night, then 7 more. By 2 in the morning, she had a picture that was no longer ambiguous in any of its details. Gideon had not simply been siphoning funds. That would have been straightforward theft, ugly but comprehensible. What he had done was something more patient and more damaging. He had been systematically manipulating the reported valuations of Oil Aaron Group's subsidiary assets over a period of nearly 2 years, inflating some, quietly deflating others, creating a distorted picture of the company's true financial position that only someone with his level of access and expertise could have produced or sustained. He had then used that distorted picture to justify selling off certain asset classes, including licensing rights, tied to a cluster of Bridgelight's secondary patents, to the same shell company network acquiring the Valley Corridor land. The scheme was designed to look, at every individual point, like a series of legitimate business decisions made by a conscientious CFO managing a complex portfolio. It only revealed its true shape when you looked at all of it together, from above, with the particular kind of patience that neither Gideon nor anyone else had expected Funke to have. He had used Bradley as a buffer, feeding Norwood Developments just enough opportunity and just enough financing to keep it moving in the direction the shell companies needed, without Bradley ever understanding he was being navigated. Bradley thought he was building an empire. He was, in fact, providing cover. Tolu brought the printed documents to the kitchen table the next morning and laid them in order, smallest finding to largest, the way she had learned to present findings from watching her mother do it. Funke read everything in silence. She did not ask questions until the last page. Then she asked one. "How long have you known it was him?" 48 hours, Tolu said. "How long have I known?" Tolu looked at her carefully. "Longer than that." Funke nodded once, set the papers down, looked out the kitchen window at the neighbor's backyard, where a sprinkler was making small, quiet arcs in the morning light. "We're not moving yet," she said. Tolu did not push. She had learned this from her mother too, that the question of when was as important as the question of what, and that a man who believed himself safe was more useful than a man who knew he had been found. Bradley came to the market for the 3rd time on a Tuesday, which was not a market day. He found Funke at the stall because she happened to be there restocking, and the fact that he had made the effort on a non-market day told her more than anything he said afterward. He had lost some of the ease he usually carried. There was a tightness around his jaw and a quality of restlessness in his hands that she had last seen during the worst period of the company's early years, when they had been 6 weeks from running out of operating capital, and he was not yet good at hiding the fear. He asked her, without his usual preamble, whether she had any idea what was happening inside her own company. She told him she had a fairly clear picture. Something moved across his face, relief and discomfort arriving at the same time, fighting for space. He said he was not warning her out of concern for her welfare. He wanted to be clear about that. He was warning her because he had recently become aware of certain information that had made him understand his own position rather differently than he had before. And because he thought she should know that the person she needed to watch was not anyone she might expect. He said the name Gideon Pratt, the way people say names they have been afraid to say, quietly, and then immediately louder, as though saying it softly first had been the mistake. Funke looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he grew visibly uncertain. "I know," she said. The two words landed on him, like a temperature change. His expression shifted through several states, before settling on something that looked, for the first time in all the years she had known him, like simple honesty. "How long?" he asked. "Long enough," she said. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, as though accepting a judgment he had not appealed, and had no intention of appealing. He left without adding anything, and this time Funke watched him go. The boardroom on the 34th floor of the Oilerin Group Tower occupied a corner of the building, where you could see, on a clear day, the entire arc of Hamilton Harbor on one side and the escarpment on the other. It was a room designed to remind people of context, that whatever conversation was happening inside it was happening inside a larger world that continued regardless. Funke had chosen it deliberately. She arrived in a charcoal blazer over a white silk shirt, the kind of outfit that required no explanation or apology. She had left the hoodie and the preserving jar labels in the car. She carried a slim folder and nothing else. Gideon Pratt was already seated when she entered. He had placed himself in his usual chair, 3 seats from the head of the table, with the practiced ease of a man who had done this every month for 8 years and saw no reason to do it differently today. He had been told only that a full subsidiary review had been called with short notice. His expression was measured, professionally attentive, and, Funke noted, very slightly too still. Tolu sat near the side of the room, not at the main table, in the configuration they had agreed on. She had a laptop open and a second monitor positioned where the board could see it. The meeting began the way Funke ran everything, efficiently, without unnecessary preamble. She covered 3 agenda items in the first 12 minutes, standard operational matters. The room settled into its rhythm. And then she advanced to the next slide, and the room's rhythm stopped. The slide showed a transaction table, 47 line items, each dated, each routed. The first traced to a payment made 22 months ago. The last was from 9 days before. Gideon's stillness became a different kind of stillness. Funke spoke through the slide without looking at him. She described the pattern of asset valuation manipulation across 6 subsidiaries, moving through the details with the same tone she used for everything, precise, level, entirely without performance. She explained how the distorted valuations had been used to justify the sale of secondary IP licensing rights. She explained where those rights had gone and through how many layers of corporate structure they had passed on the way there. She showed the land acquisitions. She showed the geological survey documents that the shell company network had clearly accessed through a source with regulatory connections. Documents that explained why the Valley Corridor land was worth what it was about to become worth. Then Tolu stood up. She was 20 years old, and she had prepared her analysis the way her mother had taught her to prepare everything. From the ground up, with no assumptions she hadn't verified herself. She walked the board through the data architecture. How the scheme had been designed to stay invisible under any single audit, and how it had only become visible when you mapped every subsidiary transaction simultaneously against an independent data set of property registrations she had pulled manually over 6 weeks. Several of the older board members exchanged glances, not the kind that doubted what they were hearing, the kind that were quietly recalculating something. Gideon did not wait for Tolu to finish. He rose from his seat and spoke over the end of her sentence. A thing he had, in 8 years of board meetings, never once done to anyone. And his voice had the quality of a man who has decided that volume is the only tool he has left. He accused Funke of fabricating a pretext. He accused her of moving against him, because she knew he possessed evidence of decisions she had made during the company's early years that would not survive public scrutiny. He was not specific, because the specificity would not have held, but he was loud, and in that particular room, on that particular morning, loud was the worst choice he could have made. Funke let him finish. Then she opened the slim folder. She laid 6 documents on the table, one at a time, without hurry. Each one was a wire transfer record. Each one traced, through a sequence of account numbers, to a personal holding account registered in Gideon Pratt's name, through a numbered company in a province he had never mentioned having any business interests in. She had known about the account for 4 months. She had said nothing, because a man who believes his tracks are well covered will keep walking in them. And every step Gideon had taken in the past 4 months had left a cleaner print than anything she could have compelled him to produce through confrontation. Gideon sat down. The room was quiet except for the hum of Tolu's laptop fan. Funke addressed the board once more. She announced the immediate freeze of all accounts under Gideon Pratt's operational authority pending a full forensic audit. She announced the withdrawal of Oileran Group Capital from the 3 Norwood Developments projects it had been supporting, effective as of the previous week, which some people in this room were already aware of. At the back of the room, seated at the invitation of a board member who had brought him in as a project partner, Bradley Norwood heard his company's name and felt the floor shift beneath his chair. He had attended this meeting believing himself to be a guest. He understood in the next 30 seconds that he had been something else entirely. The room cleared slowly, in the way rooms clear after something significant. People moving with the careful deliberateness of those who are still processing what they witnessed and don't yet trust themselves to speak freely about it. Bradley found Funke by the east-facing window, the one that looked out over the city rather than the harbor. She was looking at her phone, but not reading it, and she set it face down on the ledge when she heard him approach. He did not start with an explanation. She had known him long enough to recognize, when he had decided that the gap between what he'd said and what he'd done was too wide to bridge with justification, and that the only honest option left was to simply say so. He told her he had treated her as a supporting character in a story she had actually written. He told her he had done it deliberately at first, and then without even noticing, which was in some ways worse. He told her he had come to that market stall 3 times. The first because he wanted to feel like he had won. The second because he thought he was being generous. And the third because he was frightened. And that each time she had simply looked at him, without anger, without anything he could push against. And he had not understood until this morning, that the absence of anger was not tolerance. It was indifference. And indifference, he finally understood, was the furthest distance a person could place between themselves and someone they were done with. Funke listened to all of it. She let the silence run for a moment after he finished. "You didn't ruin me," she said. "You just moved out of my way." He absorbed this, tried briefly to find something to add to it, found nothing. She picked up her phone from the ledge and walked toward the door, where Tolu was waiting with the laptop bag over her shoulder and an expression that said she had heard everything and had no interest in prolonging the moment. They left together. Neither of them looked back. In the weeks that followed, the consequences took the shape that consequences always eventually take in the absence of anyone left to prevent them. Gideon Pratt resigned before the forensic audit was complete. The audit completed anyway. The proceedings that followed were methodical and, in their way, unremarkable. A process of documentation and attribution that moved at the pace such things always move, which is to say slowly and then permanently. Financial journalists covering the case described the scheme in several publications as one of the most precisely constructed internal frauds the region had seen from a company of Oileran Group's profile. They used the word patient often enough that Funke noticed it. Patient. As though patience were unusual. As though the only people expected to be patient were those who had no other options. Norwood Developments did not survive the withdrawal of its undisclosed financing. The 3 projects suspended within weeks. Bradley exited the company the following quarter under terms that were quiet and without ceremony. He relocated eventually to a smaller city, and whether he began telling different stories there or the same ones, Funke did not know and did not try to find out. The Valley Corridor land was returned to its original owners at assessed market value, not the suppressed prices the shell company network had originally paid. Through a court-supervised unwinding that Funke had insisted on structuring herself, rather than leaving to settlement lawyers, several of those families chose to invest a portion of the proceeds into a new agricultural cooperative that was forming in the area. The cooperative needed a silent institutional partner to anchor its first operational year. Oileran Group provided the capital. No press release was issued. The market stall closed on the last Saturday in October, as the season ended. The numbered company Tolu had registered was dissolved. The jam jars that hadn't sold went to a community food shelf in Dundas. The lot adjacent to the market, the one Funke had been watching for months, the one that had started as a surveillance point and become something else. She purchased outright in December. She had plans for it, not large plans. A small technology incubator, specifically for women who were building the first version of something and needed space and access, and the particular kind of company that comes from being surrounded by others who understand how hard the beginning actually is. She had been that person once, in a cousin's spare bedroom in Brampton, with a second-hand laptop and a problem. She was the only person she knew who could see clearly enough to solve. She had not forgotten what that felt like. She did not intend to. Tolu joined the Oileran Group board in January. Not as a favor, not as a gesture, but because 3 board members had asked for her independently after watching her present in that 34th floor room. And because the question of her merit had been settled, as far as everyone who mattered was concerned. On the morning, she walked a room full of senior executives through a 6-week data investigation that professionals twice her age had not thought to begin. She accepted the position with the same composure she brought to everything. She told her mother afterward, over dinner at a restaurant they both liked in the East End, that she had 2 conditions: that she be evaluated by the same standards as anyone else on that board, and that she never again have to label jam jars on a Saturday morning in October. Funke told her she could not promise either of those things. Tolu laughed, the kind of laugh that meant she hadn't really expected otherwise. Outside the restaurant window, the city was doing what Canadian cities do in January, enduring, quietly and without complaint, the particular difficulty of the season, trusting that what came after would be worth the wait. There is something that looks, from the outside, like defeat. The early mornings, the worn coat, the folding table set up in a parking lot at the end of summer. That is not defeat at all. It is reconnaissance. It is preparation. It is the particular work of a person who has learned that the world underestimates quietly, and that being underestimated, in the right hands, is not a wound. It is a strategy. And the woman who knows how to use it will never need anyone to announce her arrival, because, by the time the room understands who she is, she has already decided what happens next.